This episode of the Southern Hemisphere No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Curly's Ag. Curly's Ag has been in the business of developing and manufacturing innovative ag tools for the past 5 years. In that short time, they have amassed an impressive range of new and patented tools now readily available for you. Curly's Ag is home to the world's only commercially available battery drill-powered power harrow, as well as Curly's Cracker 2, an automatic broad fork making soil prep and ease in any condition. Curly's Ag is also known for the Elia 3000, a multi-purpose tilther, mulcher, and bed former all rolled into one, as well as the most recent and anticipated tool for every farm, the Hand E. The Hand E is redefining the market garden toolkit and taking the hard work out of farming. It can lift 300 kilograms with ease and smoothly maneuver over your garden bed without damaging crops. The Hand E's PDO powers the Elia 6000, mulcher and tilther, a power harrow, an auger, a compost spreader, a harvester, and more attachments. If you like to know more, please jump on their website at curlysag.com and feel free to contact them for more information. Curly's Ag are distributing in the US and soon opening up in Europe. This episode is also brought to you by Activista.
Activista's mission is to assist growers to develop soil-focused, diverse cropping systems with commercially viable seeds, appropriate equipment and soil inputs, and advice and feedback for all growers' current needs and particular situations. Activista is working diligently behind the scenes to maintain and develop their supply of seeds for profitable market farming. Small bulk quantities are at or near cost price. They have a non-GMO pledge and aim to source the best hybrid and heritage varieties to suit each segment and conditions of growers' needs nationally. Activista takes the battle out of importing specialized tools, providing sales and warranty support with all of their equipment range. They carry most, if not all, parts and have a direct line of communication with suppliers. Activista encourages customer feedback and gives personal attention to all inquiries as they see this process as a vital part of our vibrant, developing organic community.
Welcome back to the No-Till Market Garden podcast, Southern Hemisphere season. My name is Mikey, and today I am very excited to share with you this lively conversation with the one and only Nicole Masters. I first picked up Nicole's book, For the Love of the Soil, a few months ago, and at the same time I also picked up Harry Potter, The Chamber of Secrets, and I tell you, between those two, there was a full week where I did not stop reading. It was an absolutely glorious reading adventure. Nicole Masters is an agroecologist, an educator and a systems thinker who shares with us an absolute wealth of practical and instructive knowledge about all things soils, natural systems, ecology, and how, like I said before, we can better practically, and that's the emphasis word here, practically manage our farmscapes and soils on a day-to-day basis. But before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we talk today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to all First Nations peoples listening in today. I'm really absolutely stoked and pleased to be inviting Nicole Masters to the show today. Welcome aboard.
Thanks so much for having me, Mikey. I'm excited to be here.
Absolute pleasure. I'd like to start by exploring what a day or week in the life of Nicole Masters looks like, because from what I've read in your book, it looks like you have incredible fun and spend a lot of time on the road traveling or on horseback across rangelands. So let's hear a bit about that.
It is kind of a dream come true in a lot of ways in terms of what my life can look like, which is, I travel in a horse trailer with my horse and my dog, and we go from ranch to ranch across a lot of the west of the USA, working with ranchers, really looking at soil health and ecosystem function. And yeah, it's been amazing. But this season has been a little different, and I've been doing so much traveling. I had 2 months of we did 5,500 miles, so I guess it's about 7,000 kilometers, and 84 hours of driving. Visited 22 ranches, and so much of that was actually done in a car. And my horse is actually he's been out. He's had a bit of a wound, so this season hasn't looked like that. And now I'm creating content for an intensive curriculum for the coach's school. So for training agroecological coaches in what it is that I do, so we can get more people out doing the things that I do, which will be really exciting. And so I'm spending most of my days in front of the computer, and I'm like, this is not what I signed up for, but that's what I'm doing at the moment.
So you're saying that if we do your course, we can also get a trailer and travel around having a great time.
If that's what rings your bells, then for sure. Yep.
Awesome. We were just also chatting before we hit the record about whereabouts you are now. Obviously, you're a New Zealander originally, but you're currently living in the States. Could you share a little bit about where you're currently living?
Yeah. So right now I am in Big Timber, Montana, about an hour and a half northeast from Yellowstone National Park. I'm on the foothills of the Crazy Mountains, which right now I can't see due to the smoke. I think we calculated there's something like 700,000 acres are on fire to the west of us. So it's been an interesting summer. I think it's one of the worst ones that Montanans can think of. I mean, I think smoke here in summer is fairly typical, but yeah, this has been challenging.
Yeah, and I think that might be something we tap into as well, chatting a little bit about weather extremes and weather patterns. But but before we get into, I think, a bit more of a detailed or practical chat about soil and farming, I had a few more generic questions I wanted to throw your way. And the first one is pretty mainstream, but it's basically, what are your thoughts around the growing adoption of regenerative agriculture and that tag of regenerative? And in your eyes, what essentially makes something regenerative in farming?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think for me this is it feels like a lifetime dream that we're really starting to see come true, which is seeing soil health show up in the media, seeing soil health show up in policy, seeing it become more of a normalized conversation in rural communities is very exciting. I don't believe that we can continue to farm and grow food in the way that we have been without soil health, particularly if we think about resilience and adapting to climate. So I think it's about time this conversation happened, and it's been interesting to me to see the interest that's happened around my book and other people's books around, soil health, and just see how suddenly, becoming fairly infamous, I guess, in some circles. And I was a couple occasions now, I've been walking into a gas station and have someone go, "Hey, are you famous?" And I'm like, "No, I don't know, but I guess you're recognizing me. That's kind of weird." And then it's like, we never thought that we got into soil health because it would become popular and people would be like, "Oh yeah, seen your stuff." It's real funny. So I'm very excited about that aspect to see that soil health is taking off. And I think if we think of it in terms of regeneration, I think the term regenerative agriculture is suddenly becoming very trendy, and that is awesome, but it's very quickly becoming greenwashed, just like the word sustainable. And so it's being able to be flexible and adaptive, I guess, around whatever terms we want to call this. It's full ecosystem function, and I don't care what people call it and whatever that trendiness around that is, but are you actually regenerating a landscape? Are you improving the outcomes? Are you improving the food quality, the water quality? Are you reducing greenhouse gases? Are you improving your small water cycle? All of that picture, and then we can term that whatever you want. And so that's what I'm really passionate about, is that we start to see more measurements on the outcomes, so people aren't just greenwashing and labeling something and then thinking they can market that to a consumer that's becoming increasingly aware of the slipperiness of what people say that they're doing.
One thing I've really taken from your book as well is that, and you mentioned it just before, is this idea that regenerative farming is not just purely about soil, it's about landscapes, and it's about these various cycles that essentially the energy cycles, the solar cycle that are coming through and in off a farm. How challenging is it or how regenerative can isolated properties be when they essentially function outside of often do outside of a broader landscape context?
Yeah, and it's quite interesting. We had a gentleman come to a workshop recently who has livestock, but he's in the middle of Iowa and surrounded by GMO corn and soy, And he was really excited to see dung beetles, and he actually took a bucket of dung beetles with him home because there's no way dung beetles are going to fly into his property now that he's changed his management and, really looking, taking all the, anthelmintic wormers and things out. Dung beetles are not going to find his place. They won't fly over, hundreds of miles of soil. And I think he's being exposed to obviously spray drift and all that contamination. But and so I think that's an interesting case. But what I'm seeing is how impactful one property can be on their neighbours, especially if they don't come at it from a right and wrong perspective. People that really are engaging with that community, as we are seeing community uptake in a phenomenal way. Like if I look out the window where I am right now, just based on one rancher family and like what they were doing, they have influenced the uptake of, we reckon, over 50% of this area, probably in a 10-mile radius, and now running regenerative programs because of that impact of that individual. And so what we're seeing is this flow-on effect, because you can't make soil health political, really. You can't argue that soil health isn't a great idea. But I think you're right to think, like, if you just think of it as yourself as an individual and you're in isolation, then that's not regenerative thinking as well. But what is that flow-on effect? And I was looking at Will Harris's work recently at White Oak Pastures, and the impact that one individual can have in terms of revitalizing a community. And we see Diane Ian Haggerty in Western Australia doing this as well, bringing work back, bringing more money back into communities and re-enlivening some of these communities that are in fact dying. So I think that flow-on effect from even a single property can be huge.
Something that I found really exciting, and it stemmed of what you're just sharing right now. There are the names of the farmers that you share in your book and you share now. These are the ones that are kind of often leading the charge or silently leading the charge of some pretty incredible farming practices. And I think that we often have an approach in farming, this kind of cold turkey approach, expecting farmers to make dramatic changes and quick changes to occur. But what's been amazing reading your book as well and in meeting these farmers is that a lot of them, they aren't practicing under the organic title or under these regenerative tag names. They're farmers that have been of some multi-generation, some of them are new farms. But my question is, what is a realistic transition for farmers who have been practicing for X many number of years and want to push forward? What is a realistic way of moving towards better farming practices?
Well, it very much depends on the context, right? So what are they already producing? What are their inputs currently? Are they incredibly high input, genetically engineered, highly mechanized, monoculture? That's going to take longer than someone that's already, reducing their inputs or are, doing multi-species mixes. So it really depends on your climate as well, and then how degraded that resource is. So if you've been using a lot of ag chemicals and you've taken your organic matter down to 0.5%, then that's going to take longer for that system to kind of reboot. So we have some different programs in terms of, I call it the Methadone Program, but don't tell everybody, in terms of, and I don't know where I got that from. I think it might have been Dr. Arden Anderson, thinking about how do we wean off a system without having that withdrawal collapse. And I think that's what gave organics a bad name originally in the 80s, was that people just went cold turkey, pulled that rug out, and then had a system that basically went into withdrawal shock. And then you got, big losses in yields and maybe more insect and pest, damage and things like that. So we kind of have a step-by-step process in order to get people off that system. And, I say typically to people that might take 3 to 7 years, depending what you're up to. And then I see extraordinary stuff happen. And we're like, okay, well, that kind of changed some of my understandings. But, it's very much based on, what kind of, how much money have you got? How much time have you got? How much effort you're going to put into this to really shift things quickly. So for me, it's always working with what is an individual's goals. What do they want to see, and what can they what's actually realistic that they're actually going to be able to manage, and then working with people wherever they're at. So it is very much a string question, that one.
Absolutely, and I want to dive into some of those, as you said, some of these methods or tools or insights that you've developed along the way to help farmers move in a more positive direction, and to kind of I think segue into that, wanting to ask you, someone who's been working it seems like most of your work with large farms spanning thousands of acres, a lot of grazing land, and I think properties that are developing healthy soil at scale, so to speak. So I want to ask your thoughts about the potential impact of small-scale vegetable production.
Well, I think the impact, so just to clarify, I've worked in pretty much every sector, and one of my passions is how do I get chemicals out of the food supply. And so for me, it felt like working on extensive landscapes made a lot more sense in terms of impact. But when you look at where a majority of the food production is coming, that isn't from, say, corn or soy, then vegetable production, that's where we can make some of the most impact in terms of some of these places might be doing, say, 10 fungicides and insecticides in a season, multiple herbicide applications, using a lot of water. So the impact on the entire food chain by cleaning up what's happening in vegetable production or nut and seed production is just massive. So I'm very excited about the potential for that. And, there's a lot more that we can do on a smaller scale than we can on a larger scale, and a lot more kind of experimentation and trialing and working what's going to work well for you. Whereas on extensive rangeland, it might be, or even in cropping, it's like we've got to wait a whole season to kind of work that out. Whereas in smaller production, you could actually be doing multiple trials, and you could try different things every time, say, you put a lettuce down. You've actually got that opportunity to look at, well, what was the impact of trying this?
That's exciting. Let's dive into it. Let's chat about these ways. And I agree with you. I think a lot of consumers are pretty blind to the fact that specifically in the horticulture industry there is an enormous amount of pesticides and herbicides get put in there. And I think more and more a lot of people are shocked about pulses and how they're essentially how they're killed and get made ready for milling and all the rest. So I completely agree with you, and I think it's nice to have this candid conversation around what is our role as small scale farmers and small scale organic farmers in changing that perspective and creating a new story around it. Maybe should we start with soil?
Mm-hmm. Always.
Where do we start? Like what is healthy soil, and what should we be aiming for?
Yeah, and I think it is the place to start, and it's the place to keep in mind with everything that we're doing. So whatever that management practices is, it's almost, I think of it in terms of you've got to earn the right. I think Gary Zimmer said that. You've got to earn the right to do that practice. You've got to earn the right to, maybe you're going to cultivate. All right, what's the cost of that? And then how do we help rehabilitate that as fast as possible? So always using that soil health as your measurement, or your baseline, and then productions on top of that, because that's your long-term view. That's what's going to ensure that your input costs are going to be reducing, not escalating, and that you're not going to hit some kind of wall down the road because suddenly you've got a fungal disease that you can no longer control, for instance. So a healthy soil, we all have that kind of image of it, don't we? Like these beautiful dark crumbs. They're big crumbs, right? It's not that very super fine tilth that everyone seems to chase in vegetable production. It's like there's more of a crumb structure in there. And when you grab that soil and stick it together, it actually has a colloidal stick. And that's that humus. That's what's holding onto water. That's what's holding onto nutrients. That's what's giving a home to the microbes. So the way I think about it really is almost like there's a massive city underneath the ground. And that city has, like huge, big super highways that are running through it. And then it has urban streets, and it has high rises, and it has hallways and corridors and bedrooms and all of that for the microbiology to be hanging out in. And then that's what gives the space for water to slowly move through all of those different rooms and corridors and elevator shafts. And then also what gives that space for roots to then be penetrating through that. So that structure is what we're always looking to maintain. How is it that I can ensure that that whole city is functioning? Because that is in turn what then feeds my plants and ensures that I have disease and insect resistance.
Can we talk about humus? You mentioned it before, and it's something which is going to be spoken about again and again, I'm sure, in this podcast. And the main reason that I want to ask is because as a veggie grower, I think there's sometimes confusion on my behalf as well, the subtle differences between compost and humus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good. It's quite interesting because there's a debate happening in the scientific literature to say that there's no such thing as humus. And I'm like, that's blasphemy. How dare you? All right. And maybe there's not a scientific way for them to be able to explain it, but there certainly is. As people that work with the land, we know what humus is. So it is that beautiful dark brown, sticky, colloidal substance that's in the soil that came from organic matter or came from the byproducts of fungi and plant roots exuding into that soil to make this lovely dark sticky substance that if you rub hard into your fingers, it'll actually stain your fingers. And if you were to soak that substance in that soil, that humus in water, it'll actually turn that water a lovely, you get this dark chocolate color on the bottom of the let's say the jar, and then the rest of that water will actually go this golden color, right? And that's called fulvic acid. So we have a fulvic component, and then we have the humic component. It's a lovely dark chocolate. So what it is it's long chain carbon that has basically broken down as far as it can break down, right? And now it's providing a home and an energy source. So think of carbon as energy, which is why everyone's all freaking out because it's in the atmosphere because it's storing too much energy. We want that energy stored in the soil, and that humus really is your battery. So yeah, it should be this lovely dark brown substance. It only has one M, so it's not hummus. I get a few people thinking it's hummus and humus, getting confused around that. But yeah, so it's that lovely, sticky, dark brown. It's more resistant to breakdown. We're going to find that is a component of that, beautiful dark crumb structures. So if your soils are very pale, and one way to tell really is, dig and look at your soil in your garden or wherever you're farming, and then compare that to underneath a fence line or compare it to the side of the road. And if your soil is paler, then it's a pretty good indicator that you've been losing that humus component.
So in terms of an organic vegetable farmer or a vegetable farmer in general who is wanting to increase their humus component of their soil, what practices would they be doing in order to bring about the creation of humus? And also, does the application of compost aid in the process of creating humus as well?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and there's stuff that we could move kind of quickly. So think of humus has a carbon component. Compost obviously has a carbon component. So too does organic material, any kind of organic material, or even like Mikey, if you died in the middle of that field, you're organic matter, right? You're carbon, and you'll break down and you'll contribute to that component in the soil. But there's different types of cycles, right? So there's a faster cycle. So you think if you put compost and wood chips down on top of a soil surface, how you can come back the following year and it's all gone. And the reason for that is it's been broken down by different types of organisms, and as they break that down, they'll take some of it into their bodies, and some of it they actually release as carbon dioxide. So it's breathed out again, and it's important, right? So there's a breathe in and a breathe out of the soil every single day. And if you notice on your plant leaves, all the stomata, so where a plant breathes from is actually underneath that leaf surface. So as that carbon is released from the soil, the plant will actually take it up again, right? Delicious. So it's an important part of what's driving that cycle. Now, some of that might be taken in by fungi. So like fungi are going to break down some of that, woody material that's in compost, and they'll use some of that to build chitin, which is the bodies of the of the fungus. And then some of that will actually be bound up inside like this humus and inside these crumbs, and it becomes all of that aggregate structure is carbon, and that's more long-term bound in the soil. And then we have those plants are obviously taking up, carbon dioxide, and they're releasing oxygen, but also part of what they do when they're capturing sunlight energy is they're taking some of that carbon as carbohydrate, and they're releasing that out their root systems. So if we really want to look at how do we build longer term, more stable carbon, it happens through the stimulation of fungi, and it happens through the lifting of plant photosynthesis. And so the more effective we can get at sunlight capture and plant photosynthesis, then the more potential we have to dump carbon deeper down in the soil and really start building soil carbon and humus and organic matter. And so I think what people have been focused on for a long time is really the short carbon cycle, and that might be incorporating green manures, it might be adding compost, and those are all really, really good practices, but they're not necessarily the ones that are going to really build up a substantial amount of soil carbon over time. And if you talk to some of the original gurus involved in, when you read some of their books, there's been this realization that, we've been doing all this stuff and, adding all these materials, but if they look at what's happening long term, they're not really seeing these huge lifts in carbon. That happens when we start to really stimulate and lift plant health.
Great answer. And when I was reading in the book as well, as I said earlier on, my mind's been triggered by so many questions, and one of the things that you wrote, which you've mentioned just now, is about fungal life. Is in your book you wrote that anyone interested in yield or crop quality, pest control, water quality, reducing soil loss, etc., needs to get interested in fungi. And I think there's a lot of dogma when you enter into the vegetable growing space where you hear a lot of people talking about bacterially dominated soil is what vegetables need and fungally dominated soils are what trees need. Is this something which holds true?
It is, but not to the extent that people think it is, right? So we still find that vegetables will do well in a 1-to-1 or even slightly higher fungal soil than what some of the original literature was kind of talking about. And also we're seeing some of these rules break. Like we have seen mycorrhizal, so that's a type of beneficial fungus, actually colonizing non-mycorrhizal species like kale, like your brassicas, seeing these relationships form that in the literature have said is not possible, and now we're starting to see show up that, actually these plants will form mycorrhizal networks. So we're finding that most vegetable producers are far, far, far too bacterial. They're probably at like a 4-to-1 bacteria to fungi instead of like a 1-to-1. And so very bacterial dominated. And then what the issue with that is you're going to see more issues like powdery mildew, or you're going to have more stresses on those plants themselves, or you're going to start to see more encroachment or more issues with the real weedy weeds. So we're still not farming for who we want to be farming for by pushing it too bacterial.
So for a grower who's planning practically to start shifting their soil back to more balanced, what would be some of the practices that they could immediately start implementing?
So some of the practices that people I'm working with are using is if they are coming in and disturbing that ground, maybe they need a finer tilth depending on the type of crop that they're growing, that they have maybe every third year that they put that into fallow, and they'll be planting like a multi-species cover crop that they'll be incorporating. They'll be adding, more wood chip type materials into that. They'll be using some of the fungal foods. So fungi like to feed on more complex foods. And a lot of what we do in vegetable reduction is all about feeding bacteria. And bacteria will feed on the pesticides and the fungicides. They're quite happy to eat that. They'll feed on soluble nitrogen fertilizers. They will feed on the minute that you cultivate or you open that soil up, the bacteria just go through a boom cycle. So you're really stimulating bacteria whenever you are tilling. and they will eat, that green vegetable, like that green mulch or green manures. When you incorporate that, a lot of what you're incorporating is just bacterial foods. So when we think about fungi, they're going to break down more complex stuff, harder to break down stuff. So that might be things like the wood chips. But my favorite food for fungi is actually humic acid. So that's a concentrated carbon source from 65 million year old carbon materials. So soft brown coals that just it drives fungi crazy. So we will apply that to the soil. We're not going to apply that to leaf because it can stain leaves. So if we're applying something to the leaf, I might use a fulvic acid, which is another component of these soft brown coals. We also use things like fish hydrolysates, so they have a lot of fish oil and things in them, again, to that soil surface probably. And then that's going to really help to stimulate the fungi. And then think of, like, fungi really like soils that are very quiet, soils that aren't being messed about with all the time. And so looking at how can I reduce the amount of soil inversion or cultivation or disturbance that I'm doing. So I'm seeing more and more people looking at either living mulches or geotextiles or different ways to actually keep that soil as undisturbed as possible, and then just disturbing where you're actually putting your crop down, and then put that crop down with something that's going to feed fungi at the same time. So really thinking, how do I support my underground workforce all the time? And then that's where you get the outcomes. That's where you get that nutrient density and the quality. And to go back to your question about the more bacterial, if you're growing vegetables in a very bacterial soil, and you can measure them to look at how well are they photosynthesizing, and that refractometer is probably the simplest tool to do that. And what you find is most vegetables, they're photosynthesizing very poorly. They might have, like, their percentage sugars in those leaves might be like at 2%, when really you want them up at about 8%, depending on what the species is. Some of those crops you want, above 12% or 16% sugar, depending on what it is. But if you are in too bacterial a soil, then it's going to undermine the nutrient density and then undermine the quality, all right? And so you can taste it. So that stuff will taste bitter or it'll taste flavorless. We really want to be getting all of those flavor profiles, the enzymes, the vitamins, all that deliciousness happens when those plants start photosynthesizing optimally, and then they're feeding microbiology. So it's a cycle that keeps coming back and just keeps rewarding you in terms of quality. So you'll have people just banging down your doors wanting your produce. It'll store better as well, is the other thing.
Hey, you all, just jumping in real quick to give a shout out to our Patreon members at patreon.com/no-till-growers. This site is the lifeblood of our work, and we appreciate so much the support. It makes things like this small series possible and just generally enables us to keep our work free and open to anyone and everyone. We can pay our creators for their work and then keep giving that work away for free. If that's something you believe in, please consider pitching in a few bucks at patreon.com/no-till-growers. Also, there are some perks there, like first dibs and discounts on merch, books, events, that sort of stuff. And at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Stephen Smith, Oh Hi Roots, Scott Snodgrass, Jay Mill, Jacob Arthur, Jean-Martin Fortier, and Yannick Laplante. Big thanks to anyone and everyone who supports our work in any way that you can. Check out no-tillgrowers.com/support for all of our support opportunities. All right, back to the show.
What I'm enjoying hearing you share is, on the podcast, obviously being dedicated a lot to no-till practices of vegetable farming, is that there's so many anecdotes of farmers saying, they've got fruiting fungi essentially popping up all throughout their fields. The longer they're practicing no tillage, which is obviously a sign that the soils are shifting towards a more balanced state, which is super exciting. And
yeah,
one thing I took from what you've been sharing is a part of obviously creating balanced soil is about optimizing the ability of the plants to access nutrients and also unlocking nutrients potentially available in there. I know a lot of farmers and organic farmers are definitely inside that lot. We have a mild, or we do have an addiction to nitrogen. whether it be manures, pelleted chicken manure, blood and bone. Why do we put such a reliance on nitrogen as the save-all nutrient for our crops, and why is it problematic to overuse it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a global phenomenon, and one it's obviously been around for a long time. But the reason we kind of like nitrogen, it makes us feel good because we have more leafy material or more growth. But when we go and take a look at the quality of that, as your nitrogen goes up, down goes your quality. And that's been the plague of the last 100 years, is that we've lost food quality. And if you look at the World Health Organization food composition charts for these different vegetables, you'll see things like we've lost 76% of copper and zinc out of these crops, or we've lost 100% of the vitamin A, or whatever it might be. So you can go and look at those charts and see, even things like lycopene. Where's all the lycopene gone? Like, we've actually lost the quality and substance and the whole purpose of why we're doing these things. So, if you are to use manures as your nitrogen source, they need to be really well composted. That nitrogen needs to be presented to the plant in a microbial form, not in a soluble form. And the minute that you're dealing with soluble nitrogen, you've lost that quality. It needs to come through the microbial pathways, right? That's how plants naturally consume nutrients, right? It's all a plant microbial relationship, right? And we override that and go, hey, we know what you need. We're going to give you this nitrogen, and you're just going to eat what I tell you to eat, even though the plant might be, hey, you know what? That's not the best thing for me. That's not the best thing for me to be pest and disease resistant, and it's certainly not going to make me nutrient dense. So I find if a lot of people were to remove their pest and disease controls, they wouldn't be able to farm using these methods because those plants are so stressed. If you are using pelletized, say chicken manure or whatever right now, and your crops are really healthy and they're photosynthesizing really high, that's a pretty good indicator that that nitrogen is coming through the biological pathway.
So essentially having soil which is biologically dynamic, applying something like a pelleted chicken manure is going to be broken down in the process before plants are accessing that nutrients. That's obviously the goal of it.
Yes. The microbes eat first. The microbes eat first at that plate. So some people might say, like wood chip steals nitrogen from the plant, for instance, or, you put on a high sawdust by accident and you're like, oh man, and you don't grow a crop for 2 years. It's because that microbiology is actually, it has to take nitrogen out of the system in order to break that down before it can then present that to the plant. So the fact that we're even using nitrogen says to me that people are not maintaining their soil structure, right? So, if 74% of the atmosphere above us is nitrogen, the reason that you haven't got nitrogen coming through into the plant is because that biological community that's in the soil is not working. And the way that the nitrogen cycle works is in those crumbs. It's in that aggregate. So if you do anything to make it a superfine tilth, you've just lost your nitrogen engine room, right? So the engine room for that is inside the crumbs. There's nitrogen-fixing bacteria that require that crumb, just like they do in a nodule of a legume. They have those little nodes. The same things happen in the soil in that aggregate. So if you disrupt that aggregate structure, you've disrupted your nitrogen system. If you have fine structureless soils or you have any kind of compaction, you've disrupted your nitrogen cycle. And so reaching for nitrogen is one way to overcome bad farming practices, basically. Sorry.
The honesty coming through here. And it's very important to grapple with it.
Yeah, and a little bit's okay. Like we find, 5 units of nitrogen can be really beneficial, but not over that amount. You're wasting your time.
We understand that agriculture, by definition, is a human intervention. We essentially disturb natural processes, and I think in horticulture more than a lot of other forms of farming, as you said, soil disturbance has often been historically and presently a major part of cultivating and growing soils. Is it realistic? And you do share in your book a story about a nursery business who does rely on intensive soil disturbance to manage what they grow. is it realistic for us to be able to mitigate that soil damage through cover crops or permanent alley crops like you share, or is it merely just mitigating something that's bad, or is it a Band-Aid solution?
Well, I kind of feel a little bit like in that situation. So it's New Zealand's largest rootstock producer, and they're doing, grapevines and kiwi fruit and avocados. They need to have that very fine tilth in order to produce good quality rootstock. And so it's this, we know that we're disturbing this, so therefore we've got to pay for that. We're going to pay for that so we can maintain that their humus, their organic matter. And so that's what they're doing, is that they set that system back and then they repair it. They set it back and they repair it. There's always times where we do things that are less ideal. We go out and we work the soil, or we running machines and it's a little bit wet and you cause compaction. There's always things that we do that we need to come back in and go, okay, and then how do I repair that? So paying for those sins, basically, instead of continuing to sin every year and never paying that back, because you're losing extraordinary amounts of soil. And you are, even some of these organic places I've been on to are some of the biggest polluters I've ever met in terms of the amount of nutrient they have in that soil and the amount of nutrient that they're losing to waterways or into the atmosphere. So just really considering what we are doing. And then, I think if I had to choose, I would really put cultivation pretty far down my list of preferred management tools. It is so disruptive and has such a long-term negative impact on microbiology, that we'd be trying to work out ways to get around it. And I guess you've spoken to some people that are doing some cool stuff in terms of no-till production, that there's got to be people out there that have some really great case studies that I'm sure you're sharing.
I think there's some amazing case studies, but I think the movement's taken hold because people they're seeing results. It's a results-based system, which is really exciting. A part of the reason why I wanted to ask the question about soil resiliency is, though there are times in any operation where sometimes there's either a need to kind of use cultivation as a reset button, or there's a need through whatever sort of extreme weather that compaction comes around, that you don't have the time to wait for the biological process to uncompact that. And I think sometimes being inside maybe a more dogmatic no-till, no disturbance ideology, there's this real fear factor around, can I use this tool? Will I be throwing back my soil 10, 15 years? But it's nice to hear from you that it is okay to lean on some tools when we need to, because it's not always, we need to be realistic sometimes.
Yeah, and I think dogma is the death of any philosophy. It's what's probably not been good for the expansion of biodynamics or the expansion of organics is those that really just dogmatically sit on a position and make people wrong. It doesn't go well, and it's not very helpful when we're really trying to work with wherever people are at, and if someone is like doing 10 fungicides and pesticides and herbicides and they start to cultivate and that becomes their, a starting place, well, that's a good starting place. Let's do that. And just start working with wherever they're at. But yeah, I think for that reset, I think that can be a valuable tool. But again, I think most people are not monitoring and measuring things enough to even know what was that impact and how long did I take to reset that system, or am I actually every year going slowly downhill? And unfortunately, what I see is most properties are slowly declining in quality, and they're not measuring it. They don't even know until one day. I mean, it's a little bit like aging. It creeps up on you suddenly, and you look in the mirror and go, "Oh crap, when did that happen?" But that has actually slowly been happening in their soil, and people don't realize until they really hit something pretty bad. So that's why I really recommend that people do monitor and be sending in tests and using their visual assessments to really see, am I improving this resource?
Can you share a bit more about that? Because it's something which is often coming up also in the podcast as well, general management practices and how they're important across the board, no matter what part of the farm, whether it's the business side of things, managing staff, the fields. But managing and monitoring of soil is something which Some farmers, they either put on the back burners because of time. Sometimes there's been a fear factor. How do I go about it? How do I read a soil test? Could you share a few words about management and monitoring of soil?
So I actually have a really cool online school that is designed to support producers in this measurement. So it might be like 6 to 8 minute long videos, and you go out and you do something practical. So take, for instance, the slaking test. How good is that aggregate stability? Because that's really a measure of, it tells you so many things, actually, aggregate stability. So you put a little bit of soil into a jar and you look at, does that hold its shape and strength, or does it collapse and turn into mush? Right? And if it collapses, turns into mush, or just makes all that soil turn into muddy water, and all that water turn into mud, that's a pretty good indicator that you are really degrading your resource and that the microbiology are not functioning, because it's microbes that they release all of those exudates. So there's poos and wheeze and spit and vomit and all sorts of things that microbes are making all the time that actually holds the soil and sticks the soil together. So if your soil doesn't stick together, that's a pretty good indicator that you're probably just bacterially dominated and those soils will slake or fall apart. So there's actually an app, I think it's called Slake, or Slakes, and you could just download that, and it'll run you through how to take that test and take a photograph, and it'll give you a score. So you can actually score how well that soil is holding together or falling apart over time, which I find is really, really helpful. We also have an app called the Regen Platform, so people can sign up for that app, and it runs you through all the different diagnostics of measuring your soil, and then you can actually trend those changes over time, and we're finding that to be really, really helpful. So that app is actually set up for a technical consultant level, but you can choose whatever measures it is that you're looking for. So that might be earthworms, it might be how deep is your topsoil, your aggregate stability, your water infiltration, whatever. And one thing I'd like to see people do more often too is be measuring the quality of the water that enters your property and the quality of the water that leaves your property. You know, are you part of cleaning up and providing a sponge to really improve the water quality? So that's something that's quite helpful too.
I want to know about finding those partnerships with labs and testing, because you do share so much about, SAP analysis and water quality. Where should a farmer be looking to form those partnerships or places to work with?
There are some great labs all around the world. So I can't really speak to specific names of laboratories, but you want to look for laboratories that have been working from this biological context for some time, that they're not just going to give you a test that says NPK. Any lab that's providing a test like that is probably a lab to be avoided. They're just working in with the chemical systems. But there's so many really good biological tests, and we use a lot of leaf analysis, and I'm seeing an increasing focus on SAP analysis. We used to use SAP analysis in horticulture like 20 years ago, and I'm now seeing that becoming available for different types of crops. So that's pretty exciting when we were looking at your soil test can say whatever that soil test says. That doesn't necessarily reflect on what is the plant able to access, because that's more about microbiology. That's more about your farming system. So really looking at, are we getting nutrition through? And I'm excited to see there are more meters now coming out. So the bionutrient meters that you can which use mass spectrometry, whatever. I'm going to screw that word up. Mass spectrometers that will be able to actually tell you the nutrient density of food. We're starting to see those come out at a level that someone can walk into a grocery store and actually be able to measure the nutrition of whatever that fruit and vegetable might be. And the people that are developing these meters are starting to work on developing that for meat as well. So you'd be able to actually scan that meat and know, did that come from a grain-fed operation, or did that come from a place that actually was feeding on native range, for instance, or was grass-fed, which it's going to be very exciting because it's going to get past all of these labels that people say they're doing whatever they're saying, but this meter will actually tell you what's the nutrition.
Wow, that'd be an absolute dream.
Yeah, totally. I'll be lining up for those meters, and it's going to get hard to eat food for a while.
Oh, I can imagine. And the interesting part about that as well is one of the questions I actually wrote down was actually relating to communicating with consumers the message, whether it's, you know, articulating the story, the facts around healthy soil, which, as you're saying, a spectrometer, that's a way of, obviously, people seem to be well sold by science. And unless you're highly articulate and well versed in peer-reviewed papers, it can be sometimes difficult having a conversation with, I think, maybe the mainstream consumer who is maybe slightly apathetic or is a bit more kind of like, what really are the health benefits of organic food? What is some of your advice around articulating or sharing this message?
I think in conveying that message that you do it with integrity. You know, we really are being authentic and transparent with what you are doing. Because I think people are getting really jaded about the misleading messaging that's been happening. I think to have an open door or feel like, I say this to a lot of my producers, you know, feel like you've actually got someone from California looking over your shoulder as we're doing some of these things. And could you actually stand up and say that actually this was a necessary action, or and this has all these benefits, so this is why I'm doing this. But I think the best way to communicate it is actually through the quality of the food that you're producing. And I go to farmers markets and you hear people say, oh, you know, this is more nutrient dense, or we're drawing down more carbon. And I'm like, cool, can I see your data? And they don't have any, you know, and it's like, don't make claims that you can't back up. If you have nutrient density, you can taste it. So let people taste test whatever it is. I don't know if COVID lets people do that anymore, but, you know, like really be able to taste those flavor profiles, because those flavor profiles are all given by microbiology. You know, that's what gives all those secondary metabolites and the flavonoids and all of that stuff that makes things taste amazing and smell amazing, is that relationship with soil. So being able to convey that, or being able to take some of these measurements. So I am encouraging, you know, any of the producers I work with is send in samples to the laboratories. And if you know, like say it is a tomato, you know that tomatoes are promoted because of their antioxidants and their levels of lycopene, test for lycopene, and then test that compared to, you know, a bog standard conventional fruit. And you'll find that your lycopene will be significantly higher. Using that data to kind of convey that in a way that people already understand, or even educating people, it might be something that is a secondary metabolite that people don't know about, but you're like, well, this has these anti-inflammatory compounds, all right? And our anti-inflammatory compounds are this much higher than the bog standard. There was actually a vegetable producer in New Zealand that they did this whole scale across New Zealand, was actually set what these levels currently were in conventional agriculture for different types of fruit and vegetables. And his plan was to come in and above that with regenerative practices and be significantly higher. And unfortunately, they had some family dynamics and he lost the business. So it never happened. But those levels were actually set in New Zealand. So I imagine in Australia, there's some of that data has probably been done. And to be able to demonstrate and show, look, we are doing a really good job, and this is one way, is actually measuring those outcomes. And the other thing to do would be to measure the residue, and to be able to really demonstrate that we have no chemical residues in the food, because even organics are showing up with residues because they haven't kickstart the biological complex, so that there might be chemicals that are, you know, they were sitting in the soil 4 years ago and you've been organic for 3, so you're certified organic, but those chemicals are starting to be released. Or here in the States, 90% of rainfall has glyphosate in it, so that glyphosate's falling onto the leaf surfaces, and if your leaves are not covered with beneficial microbes that can break that residue down or change its components, then organic produce is showing up beyond the EU standards for residue levels, right? But crops that are using regenerative soil health systems are actually finding that their crops are showing up nil residue, even if they're using a small amount of chemical, right? So it's about building that robust system that's able to break down those compounds.
Wow. I really felt what you were saying about communicating the message to the farmers market through all the means that you said, self-testing, because one, it's super empowering for the person, like you're saying, the farmer sharing the information, because it isn't out there in some deep dark web of the science. It's super humbling because it shows what each farmer's doing, and it's highly practical. And I think that's something which I think that's advice that I wish I had when I was selling at the farmers markets. It would have made me be able to hold my ground a lot more proudly, and like you said,
yes.
in a way that delivers the message that says exactly, taste this. If this is where I am, this is what I'm growing. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, there's a vegetable producer that I just think she's amazing. Her name's Patty Armbrister up in on the High Line in Montana, and she's growing super high brix produce that is not susceptible to insects and diseases, and you can taste it. Like you taste those vegetables. There's no going back. You've now ruined that consumer forever. They'll only come and take. They only want to eat your produce because it doesn't taste all bitter. It's super sweet. We get this photosynthesis really humming, and there starts to be more and more sugar in those plants. I mean, you can taste it. It's amazing.
Why has do you think science been a little bit both? Well, I think in some parts it's been very behind in catching up with a lot of anecdotal and visual experience. I think anecdotes that farmers themselves have seen, and on sometimes it's been very progressive. How do we kind of balance? How do we balance that relationship with the science world and ecological farming?
Yeah, it's kind of a topic dear to my heart. And it's interesting. I was at a conference a few years ago, and a scientist came up to me and he said, "What happened to New Zealand?" He's like, "We used to hear about New Zealand all the time, and you guys were leading the way." And then he said, in the early 90s, that just kind of stopped. And I said, well, it's because the whole funding system for research in New Zealand changed. So New Zealand used to do the most amazing public good research. It was research about practices. It was research about earthworms or protozoa or, these. It wasn't looking at a product. Whereas after 1991, you had to demonstrate that there was going to be a commercial application for the research that you were doing when it was, government-owned research facilities. If you wanted a grant, you had to say, I will have something that I could produce. So it became very much swayed towards that corporate approach as opposed to good management practices, or this was just something that was going to benefit farmers. There wasn't someone who was going to clip the ticket along the way, which has been a long history of farming. Is that it's the middlemen that are going to make the money. It's not farmers are not making any more money out of this whole process. But what's interesting is we're seeing more and more really neat stuff showing up in the literature. It's just not being communicated more widely, which is kind of part of what I feel like my job is I spend a lot of time in the literature and then looking at how does that actually relate practically on the ground? What does that mean? So a lot of the breakthroughs that we're seeing in the human microbiome are being reflected by breakthroughs in the soil microbiome in terms of understanding how plants are communicating to microbiology, or a plant might communicate to a disease or an insect. And then what are the methods that a producer could use to undermine that or improve that signal as such. So I feel like there is some incredible research going on. It's just people often that are researchers are not necessarily very good public communicators. Actually, I was talking to a researcher recently, and she reckoned that 90% of her staff and team were on the Asperger's spectrum. And so it's like, those are not the people that are going to be great out. And I'm not saying everyone has Asperger's who's a researcher, but might not be the people that are going to be communicating to the public. And that's the role of extension and educators like myself.
Absolutely. And I think it's maybe something that we also here at the podcast, which we try to do, and we can also try to do more of.
Yes.
Try to reach out to people like yourself. And, if you do come across any amazing research, please feel free to shoot it through to me so I can spread it far and wide as well as best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. So the podcasts and webinars and all sorts of things that we're seeing right now are, yeah, I think of some of the scientists I've watched recently, and if you get a good interviewer, you can really pull them out of their little bubble. So cute.
Well, sure, and like someone like yourself has been, I think, jumping back to the beginning, you're talking about you walking into people spotting you out as, you're the famous person, is because we really do need people like you in the industry who can share that message, who can articulate something, and who are a super bubbly character that draw people in. So let's hope there's more researchers and science-based workers out there like yourself who can jump into these social media spaces and share what they're learning.
Yeah, totally. And I very much feel like a magpie. You kind of collect the shiny things, but it's all of this collective knowledge is all just woven together in this beautiful tapestry that is, I mean, it's thousands of people right now that are all collaborating and adding their weave into this tapestry, which I'm incredibly excited about. So I don't think it's any one individual that can even carry the weight of everything that's going to happen right now. It has to be done from the community and really from the ground up.
Nicole, we've reached our hour, and I'm hoping that if I ask you a question about Vermi Compost, you're going to be excited enough to stay on the line for a bit longer.
Yeah.
Could you share, I know as an early passion, and you also had a business which was built around Vermi Compost, what role do you see Vermi Compost being for small-scale vegetable growers like ourselves?
Yeah, it's quite funny. It was such an early passion and something I fell into, and it always surprises me that over 20 years later, it's still something that I get asked about, and it's still something that I get all my producers to do. Even large scale ranches are doing vermi composting or vermicast or vermiculture. When I think of vermicomposting, the definition of that word is an unfinished product. So we can make a vermicompost pretty quickly. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a very high quality product. So for me, I used to make different types of vermicast based on where was that product going. Was that for strawberry production or vegetable production or avocados or pasture? So really, there's so much application for it in vegetable production. So I want you to kind of consider how what comes out of a worm's butt is literally the elixir of life for a plant. So it's like the worm knows, hey, like a plant needs plant growth enzymes. It needs hormones. It needs, these nutrients in these forms. It needs these types of microbiology. And that's what comes out of a worm. So, it really, for me, is one of the foundational support mechanisms if you can do it, but you don't need a lot. However, you can grow vegetables just in vermicast. Like you can have pure vermicast and grow really great quality vegetables. And I was growing a high fungal vermicast, and this was just in the home garden, but high quality, very fungal vermicast, and grew probably the best garden I've ever had in my life. And when we talk about plant photosynthesis, like a kale plant, when you test that in the grocery store, might be running a Brix, so percentage sugars of about 2 or 3. This was running at 15 or 16 Brix. And you can taste that. And I watched my son walk to the school bus, and he'd grab a handful of kale and walk and eat it. And I'm like, that's not normal. That is not normal for like a 10-year-old boy to want to have a handful of kale. So I think this is one of the ways that we can really, we talk about biopriming. So, coating seed in vermicast, or doing root dips if you're transplanting seedlings, or just finding ways to get that beneficial microbiology in there, or all of their signaling metabolites to set that plant up for health. And the minute that we're getting that out into the soil, if it has that microbiome, and it has all that biology around it, and those enzymes and those hormones that vermicast provides, we really are setting that plant up for success.
And in terms of the DIY possibilities for farmers, like you're saying, setting up those systems, is it generally a pretty easy, low-cost process that they can do the research online to find out the best ways of doing that?
Oh, totally. And so simple and so low cost. And in fact, I have a webinar called the Worminar that people can Google, and it has everything that you need basically to get yourself started. So if you're spending a lot of money, then you're probably doing it wrong. Just saying. Like, worm systems can be incredibly cheap, simple. Just put them on the ground. Don't overcomplicate it. And then you can make like a worm liquid or whatever from the finished vermicast when you're finished making that. So there's no need for small producers to overcomplicate it. I think if you want to get into large scale commercial, then there's all sorts of cool stuff that you can do. But I'd say 95% of people that I work with, we just got windrows on the ground. Very simple.
It's a really exciting one because as I think the more farming is developing and becoming, the industrial format of farming is about, everything off the shelf. It's what can I buy off the shelf? And I think vermicomposting, as you're saying, or vermiculture is so exciting because it is so do-it-yourself, and it can be applied, as you've shared, both as a vermicast or as a liquid. When would you use it as a liquid as opposed to a vermicast application on the floor, on the ground? Sorry.
Yeah, probably like if you like at seeding, I maybe want to put a solid down, and you could just put it in furrow. Liquid you could do as a foliar application, and you can do as a soil drench as well. So I mean, liquids you could use anytime. Solids obviously going to be easier early in the season or at the end of the season as well as a hygiene cleanup. So you can put a solid down and also do a liquid spray if you have got any disease present, or you're just going to leave those beds over winter or whatever. Then it will help to clean up any residuals and clean up any disease that might be in there. So I think that's always a good idea. Yeah, and some of vegetable producers I know are doing like 6 applications of a liquid in a season, because and that's in tilled systems. You have a more disturbed environment. Whereas I think if you're doing no till, that might be something you'd maybe do twice a year.
My last question that I want to ask you is, what has been one of the most exciting discoveries that you've come across in the last X many years of your work that still excites you today?
It's so many.
I can imagine.
I think just discovering soil was pretty darn cool. I think probably one of the biggest things was around herbicide resistance, but also seeing the germination signals, like seeing how we could change a soil environment and it would change the types of species that would germinate, and seeing that happen within a 2-year period, suddenly switching on a native seed bank and switching off weed pressures. So some of the cropping guys I work with get kind of freaked out because they start to see really, really clean beds. So they might do a pre-emergent herbicide, and we might put vermi liquid with that. So we're actually putting worm teas with their herbicides, or a fulvic acid with that herbicide, and then they're planting in a crop. And when that crop grows, they're not having to do a post-emergent herbicide because you've got the bioprime seed, so you've got microbiology that goes with the seed. We put that fulvic acid out. We're doing biological foods, and what they find is that crop comes up, and there's very few weed species that also germinate. So seeing like bare ground between these row crops is weird, because you kind of get used to, we're going to have some kind of plants coming up and they're going to have to spray a post-emergent herbicide, or they've got herbicide resistance, and seeing that all disappear has been such a light bulb moment and so exciting, I think, for the potential for that globally, in terms of there's things that we can do that will switch off the gene expression for herbicide resistance, and there's things that we can do to switch on the soil so that what germinates is your targeted species, is these types of plants are what I want to see germinate, and seeing people not having to be chasing their tail weeding. There's a whole world out there, and I think there hasn't been a lot or anywhere near enough research into what is going on with those dynamics. But yeah, we're seeing some stuff show up in the literature.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I can't recommend to the audience enough reading your book and also jumping on your website. And now that I know you've got all these workshops as well, I'm super excited to get on and give them a go. So thank you so much for all the work and for articulating in a super palatable way all the work you do, which can be a mouthful, mind-boggling and confusing often. So it's an awesome service you're doing for all of us farmers who sometimes don't have the time to read every single peer-reviewed article or literature out there. So thank you for doing it for us.
You're trawling through it. No, I appreciate that. And I think thank you to the producers that I guess I stand upon their shoulders, really, and for the extraordinary work that people are doing around the world right now. Like, the world needs you and needs you all working in our different realms of influence, I guess. And I think it's more important now, more than ever, that people are doing this work and then letting others know what you're up to. Don't be afraid to tell your neighbors what you're doing. It's time for them to hear it.
On that note, thank you very much, Nicole Masters, for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Mikey. It's been great.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to check out the links in the show notes. Today's episode was produced by Mikey Densham with help from No-Till Growers. Music by Willie Breeding. We'll be back next week, and thank you for listening. Bye.